Imagine a place where nearly 1 in 5 homes sits empty. That is the reality in Kagoshima Prefecture, in southern Japan, where the home vacancy rate stands at 20.48%. For a foreign buyer, that statistic signals a surplus of empty properties, an anomaly in most housing markets. In your own country, such a figure would likely signal a crisis or a collapsing neighborhood. Here, it creates an unusual opportunity. But accessing that opportunity requires a specific first step. To bid in a tax office auction, you must put down a refundable deposit equal to 10% of the minimum bid. This is not a fee or a commission. It is a refundable deposit, meaning you get it back if you do not win. But you must have it ready up front. Why does this matter? Because the deposit requirement is the first concrete action that separates curious shoppers from serious buyers. Anyone can browse listings online. Anyone can dream of a cheap Japanese home. But putting down 10% of the minimum bid forces a decision. It asks, are you willing to risk that money for a chance? In one documented case, a buyer targeted a property with a minimum bid of about 3 million yen, roughly $20,000. That meant putting down 300,000 yen, around $2,000, as a deposit before the auction even started. Compare that to buying a home in your own country, where you might tour a property, make an offer, and only then arrange financing. Here, the deposit comes first. It is a gatekeeper. The risk is that you lose the deposit if you win the bid and then fail to complete the purchase. The reward is that this requirement weeds out casual interest, leaving fewer competitors for the properties that remain. For a serious buyer, this deposit is simply the price of admission to a market full of empty homes waiting for a new owner. Now, consider just how many empty properties are waiting. Kagoshima alone has about 184,200 vacant homes. That is a massive inventory, far larger than most outsiders expect. The sheer number raises a natural question. Why are so many homes sitting empty, and can you actually afford one? The answer begins with the price. In one documented case, a property was advertised for under $20,000. That is an astonishingly low entry point for a house. However, that price tag does not include everything. A professional housing inspection is a necessary hidden cost. For a regular or basic check, you will pay between 50,000 and 70,000 Japanese yen. For a more detailed inspection, the cost jumps to over 100,000 yen. This fee is your safeguard against buying a structure with serious flaws. Without it, you risk inheriting expensive problems. So the low purchase price is real, but the inspection is a mandatory step that adds several $100s to your budget. It is a small price for clarity, but one you must plan for from the start. But here is where the surprise hits. The second house you view might be priced over $70,000. That is a huge jump from the under $20,000 homes you saw first. This range raises an immediate question. Why such a gap? The answer starts with a simple definition. An Akiya is any vacant house in Japan, but not all are abandoned junk. Some are well-maintained properties where the owner simply moved away. Now consider the numbers. About 13.5% of all houses in Japan sit empty. That is a staggering vacancy rate, far higher than in most Western countries. Yet less than 3% of those Akiya are actually listed for sale anywhere. This tiny fraction creates a bottleneck. In your home country, a high vacancy rate would mean a buyer's market with plenty of choice. Here, it means the opposite. The vast majority of empty homes never reach a real estate agent or a website. They sit hidden, tied up by owners who do not want to sell. This scarcity forces you to search actively, not passively browse. You cannot wait for a perfect listing to appear. You must dig deeper. This video is made for you, the prospective buyer targeting homes under $75,000. That price point comes with a surprising risk. One buyer needed pipe replacement and received 3 quotes. They range from roughly $3,000 to $10,000. That is a shocking difference for the same job. Why such a gap? In rural Kagoshima, finding a plumber can mean paying for travel time and emergency rates. The pipework may also be old or buried in concrete, requiring extra labor. You cannot predict these costs from photos alone. Compare this to central Sapporo, where investors may see returns up to 12% before costs. That is a city market. Kagoshima's rural nature adds risk. The landscape is beautiful, but services are spread thin. A cheap house can quickly become expensive if hidden problems emerge. The warning is clear: budget generously for surprise expenses. Do not assume a low purchase price means low total cost. The payoff for getting it right is a home far cheaper than any in your own country, but only if you prepare for the unseen. So why would anyone buy when renting seems so straightforward? In Kagoshima, the numbers flip the logic. A second-hand 4-bedroom detached house on 170 square meters costs about 5 million yen, which is roughly $34,000. Renting a similar 4-bedroom house in the same area runs around 60,000 yen per month, or about $400. That means the purchase price equals roughly 7 years of rent. In your own country, that ratio is almost unheard of. But here is the anomaly. Land nearby tells a different story. A 1,300 square meter block was on the market for around 22 million yen, about $150,000. That land alone costs over 4 times the house price. This reveals the stakes for an outsider. You are not just buying a structure. You are buying into a market where the building itself has almost no value, while the dirt beneath it still commands a premium. One buyer in this situation would face a choice: pay rent forever for a similar home, or own the house outright for a fraction of the land cost. The mechanism is simple. Japan depreciates its houses to zero over 20 to 30 years. The value sits in the land. So a cheap house on expensive land is not a bargain. It is a property tax liability waiting to grow. The warning is clear. Do not let the low house price trick you into ignoring the land valuation. That land cost will follow you every year through tax bills. The payoff, however, is genuine. If you find a house where the land is modestly priced, you secure a home for the cost of a few years of rent back home. Here is the surprise. Many of those cheap, empty houses you are eyeing are not actually for sale. You might wonder why an owner would leave a property to rot rather than sell it. The answer lies in a quiet contradiction inside Japan's property system. First, understand the obligation. In Japan, property tax is owed every year by the registered owner, no matter where that owner lives. If you inherit a house in Kagoshima, but move to Tokyo, you still pay the tax. If you move overseas, you still pay. The bill arrives annually, and it does not stop just because the building is empty. Now consider the price. Rural Kagoshima has very low property values. A house that might cost you $20,000 on the open market is worth a similar amount to its owner. Selling that house, after real estate commissions and legal fees, might net the owner only a few $1,000s. For that sum, many owners simply decide it is not worth the hassle. There is also a deeper reluctance at play. A family home is often tied to memory and identity. Imagine inheriting your grandparents' house in a quiet valley. You do not use it, and you cannot afford to maintain it. But selling it for a price that feels insultingly low, perhaps less than the cost of a used car, can feel like a betrayal. So you do nothing. You pay the tax each year, hoping the problem will solve itself. Compare this to what you know from your own country. In most Western housing markets, if you stop using a property, you sell it quickly to avoid ongoing costs. The high prices make that sale worthwhile. In rural Japan, the math flips. The cost of holding the property is real, but the reward for selling is tiny. The owner is caught between a small annual loss and a one-time loss of face. The result is a growing stock of abandoned homes. Owners become passive. They pay the tax, let the weeds grow, and wait. For you, the buyer, this creates a puzzle. The houses you want exist, but the owners are not motivated to offer them. You cannot buy what is not listed. The opportunity is real, but the path to it requires understanding why the seller is stuck. The first step is to recognize that the owner's inaction is not laziness, it is a rational response to a system that taxes ownership but does not reward sale. This is where the system's logic turns against itself. Real estate agents have low interest in cheap Akiya because commissions are low. In Japan, the standard commission is a percentage of the sale price. A home selling for $20,000 generates a fee of only a few $100s. That is not worth an agent's time to market, show, or negotiate. So the cheapest properties sit invisible, unlisted, and unknown to buyers like you. Meanwhile, the owner is still on the hook for annual property tax. If those taxes go unpaid, penalties begin to accumulate. If the owner continues to ignore them, the local tax office may eventually claim the property. This is not a quick process, but it is a real one. After repeated warnings and a statutory waiting period, the government can seize the home and put it up for auction. That auction is where many Akiya finally enter the market. This mechanism feels strange if you come from a country where real estate almost always rises in value. In your home market, a cheap property might signal a fixer-upper that will appreciate. But Japanese real estate prices on the whole tend to depreciate with time, especially outside major cities. A house in Kagoshima is not an investment that grows. It is a liability that shrinks. The owner knows this. They face a choice: pay taxes on a losing asset or walk away. Many choose to walk. In one documented case, an owner inherited a rural property near Kagoshima City. The home was structurally sound but outdated. The annual tax bill was modest, only a few $100s. But the owner lived in Tokyo and had no use for the house. Selling it would require hiring an agent, paying for cleaning and repairs, and accepting a price far below what the owner's parents had paid decades earlier. So the owner did nothing. The tax bills went unpaid. After several years, the tax office seized the property and scheduled an auction. A buyer eventually won it for less than the back taxes owed. The implication for you is clear. The cheapest Akiya are often invisible until the government forces them onto the auction block. To find them, you cannot rely on standard real estate listings. You must search municipal Akiya banks, check tax office auction schedules, and monitor properties that have been abandoned long enough to trigger seizure. This takes patience. The risk is that you bid on a property without knowing its full condition, and you may have to evict a stubborn occupant or inherit a large tax liability. The payoff is a home at a price that seems impossible in any other developed country. But you must accept that the system is designed to discourage the seller, not to help you. You might expect that once you own the house, the surprises are over. But the hidden challenges are just beginning. Consider the plumbing. In many older Japanese homes, the pipes were buried directly in the ground beneath the house. They were not placed in an accessible crawl space or floor cavity. That means if a pipe cracks or clogs, you cannot simply go under the house to fix it. Instead, you must dig up the foundation or break through the concrete slab. This turns a simple repair into a major construction project that can cost thousands of dollars more than you anticipated. Then there is the property tax. In your home country, a larger house might mean a higher tax bill, but in Japan, the system has a particular sting. The tax is calculated on the assessed value of the land and the building. A sprawling Akiya with a big footprint and multiple rooms will have a significantly higher tax than a compact one. You might buy a huge house for a bargain price, only to discover that the annual property tax is a heavy, recurring expense that never goes away. For a buyer on a tight budget, that tax bill can become a financial burden that erodes the savings from the cheap purchase price. Perhaps the most uncomfortable hidden challenge is when the property is still occupied. You might assume that an empty house is truly empty, but some Akiya are sold with a sitting tenant or a former owner still living there. In Japan, the buyer inherits the responsibility for that occupant. You would have to handle the eviction yourself through the legal system. This process can take months, involve court fees, and create significant stress. One buyer might find themselves paying for legal notices and translation services, all while the occupant remains in the home. It is a far cry from the clean, vacant property you imagined. Compare this to buying a house in your own country. There, the seller typically guarantees vacant possession. The pipes are usually in a basement or crawl space. The tax is often disclosed upfront in a transparent way. In Japan, the Akiya system places those burdens squarely on you. The reward for navigating these challenges is a home at a price that seems impossible elsewhere. But you must accept that the system is designed to discourage the seller, not to help you. The payoff is real, but only if you prepare for these hidden costs first. Consider a real example. One buyer placed a bid of 3 million yen, which is roughly 20,000 US dollars. They won the auction against just one other bidder. That competitor had offered barely above the minimum of 2.9 million yen. The land size was just under 1,400 square meters. That is an enormous plot by any standard. In many countries, a property that size would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here, the winning bid was about the price of a used car. This raises an obvious question. Why would so much land sell for so little? Part of the answer lies in what sits on that land. The official lifespan of housing stock in Japan is just 35 years. That does not mean the house will collapse. It means the structure is considered depreciated to zero value. After 3.5 decades, the building is treated as a liability, not an asset. The tax system, the insurance industry, and the resale market all reflect this assumption. So when you bid on an Akiya property, you are mostly buying the land. The house itself is often considered worthless or even a cost to remove. In this case, the buyer paid $20,000 for nearly a third of an acre. That sounds like a steal, but the house on the lot was already past its official lifespan. Any renovation would need to account for a structure that the market has already written off. The short lifespan creates a constant cycle of demolition and rebuilding. In your home country, a house from the 1960s might still be perfectly livable. In Japan, that same house is statistically obsolete. This is not a judgment about quality. It is a cultural and regulatory reality that shapes every transaction. The warning is clear. A low bid can win you a huge piece of land, but the house may be a burden rather than a bargain. You must inspect the building as if it were already condemned. Budget for demolition or extensive structural work. The payoff is that you control a large property in Kagoshima for a fraction of what similar land would cost elsewhere. But that payoff depends on accepting the 35-year rule as your starting point, not an afterthought. So why does Japan have so many cheap, empty homes? The answer is a demographic shift unlike almost anything in the developed world. By the end of 2023, the number of Akiya in Japan hit an estimated 10 million. To frame that number, think of it this way. 1 out of every 7 properties across the entire country now sits vacant. That is 15% of all Japanese real estate, a staggering proportion. The mechanism behind this surplus is straightforward. Japan's population is shrinking fast. Current projections show it will drop by 20% by 2050, falling to 100 million people. At the same time, the share of the population over age 65 will reach 1/3. Fewer people means fewer households need homes. So the supply of empty houses grows every year. This is a surprising anomaly for most outsiders. In many Western countries, housing is scarce and expensive. You are used to bidding wars and rising prices. Japan presents the opposite problem. Too many houses, not enough buyers. The question it raises is simple. Why are these homes not being sold or demolished? The answer connects directly to the aging population. Elderly owners pass away or move into care facilities. Their children often live in distant cities and have no interest in inheriting a depreciating asset in a depopulating region. Consider a concrete example. Imagine a quiet neighborhood in Kagoshima. On one street, 3 houses stand empty. The owners are all over 80. Their heirs live in Tokyo and have no plan to move south. The properties are worth very little on paper, but they still carry annual tax bills and maintenance costs. So the heirs simply leave them abandoned. That pattern repeats thousands of times across Japan. Compare this to your own country. In most places, a vacant home in a desirable area would be snapped up quickly by investors or young families. In Kagoshima, the opposite is true. The local population is declining, so demand is weak. The result is a growing stock of Akiya that nobody claims. The implication for you as a buyer is clear. The supply of cheap properties will not dry up anytime soon. It will likely increase. The warning here is that you should not expect a quick turnaround in value. These homes are cheap because the broader market is shrinking. The payoff is that you can enter that market on your own terms, buying a property for far less than replacement cost, as long as you understand the demographic forces that created the opportunity. Now let's talk about the kind of property that makes this entire search worthwhile. It is not unheard of to find spellbinding, majestic heritage properties for under $20,000. That figure is roughly 3 million Japanese yen. The question this raises is simple. How can a traditional home with history and character cost less than a used car in your own country? The answer lies in Japan's unique combination of depopulation and strict building codes. A heritage property is often a machiya, a traditional wooden townhouse, or a kaminka, an old farmhouse. These structures were built with craftsmanship that modern homes rarely match. Yet their value has collapsed because the local population has moved away. So the same forces that create the Akiya surplus also make these architectural treasures affordable. To frame the stakes for an outsider, you are not buying a fixer-upper. You are buying a piece of cultural heritage that someone else has abandoned. The mechanism that makes this viable is renovation subsidies. Kyoto City, for example, offers half of the renovation costs up to 2 million Japanese yen, about $13,000 on designated traditional townhouse properties under its Makizukuri fund. That means if you buy a machiya for $20,000, the city might pay half of your renovation costs, capping their contribution at $13,000. Your out-of-pocket expense for the renovation could drop dramatically. One documented case involved a buyer who found a 100-year-old townhouse in a historic district. The purchase price was under $20,000. The renovation quote came to $30,000. The city subsidy covered half of that work, leaving the owner with a fully restored home for a total cost of roughly $36,000. Compare that to your own country. A century-old home in any major city would likely cost several $100,000 before you even begin to think about restoration. Here, the combination of a low purchase price and a generous subsidy flips the economics. Kyoto Prefecture goes even further. Its initiative offers up to 5 million Japanese yen towards the renovation of traditional farmhouses over 50 years old. That is roughly $33,000. If you find a kaminka for $20,000, the prefecture could cover most or all of the renovation. The warning is this: not every heritage property qualifies. You must check that the home is designated under the specific fund. A mistake here means you pay full renovation costs yourself. The payoff for getting it right is a home with hand-carved beams, sliding paper doors, and a garden that has stood for generations. You get the heritage without the heritage price tag. So how do you actually find one of these properties? The answer starts with an anomaly. In most countries, an abandoned house sits in legal limbo, owned by someone who cannot be found, stuck between neglect and repossession. In Kagoshima, the process is surprisingly direct. When an owner stops paying property taxes and disappears, the local government eventually takes possession. This is not a rare loophole. It is the main mechanism that puts cheap Akiya onto the market. Define the terms. An Akiya is simply a vacant home. A seized property is one the government has taken because the owner owed taxes and could not be traced. The stakes are straightforward. You cannot buy what is not for sale. Most Akiya never appear on any website. The ones that do are often the ones the government now owns. That is your entry point. Why does this matter? The causal chain is simple. Owners abandon homes because the property tax bill outweighs the home's value. They stop paying. They vanish. The local government, unable to collect, eventually seizes the land and the structure. Then the property enters a municipal auction or a public listing. That is when a foreign buyer can act. Consider one concrete scenario. A house sits on a hillside in Kagoshima, its roof sagging, garden overgrown. The owner died 10 years ago with no heirs. The tax bill accumulated. The city took it. Now it appears on the Atome website, a user-friendly platform that lets you search by region, price, and condition. If your browser is set to English, the site adjusts automatically. You scroll through photos, see the floor plan, note the starting bid. Compare this to what you know. In your home country, buying a seized property often means dealing with a government auction house, paperwork in your native language, and a bidding process that favors locals. In Kagoshima, the entire listing is online. The Atome website is designed for anyone. You do not need a Japanese real estate agent to find it. You do not need to speak Japanese to browse it. What does this mean for you? It means the first step is not a flight to Japan. It is a Google search. You open the Atome website, switch to English, and start looking at auction properties and listed Akiya. The future of your purchase begins on a screen, not in a car. Here is the sequence. First, go to the Atome website. Second, filter by Kagoshima Prefecture. Third, look for properties marked as seized or tax delinquent. Fourth, note the auction date and the required deposit. Fifth, contact the Municipal Akiya Bank, a local government office that handles these sales. They will confirm the property is available and explain the bidding rules. A warning: do not assume every cheap listing is a bargain. Some seized properties come with hidden liens, debts attached to the land that you inherit. The Municipal Akiya Bank will disclose these, but only if you ask. Always request a full property history before you bid. One buyer in a documented case won a lot for 3 million yen, roughly $20,000, only to discover a 6-figure cleanup order from a previous owner's illegal dumping. He had to walk away from the deposit. The payoff for getting it right is a home you could not afford anywhere else. You use the Atone website as your front door. You let the municipal Akiya Bank guide you through the paperwork. You bid on a property the government needs to offload. And you end up with a house in Kagoshima, hand-carved beams, sliding paper doors, a garden that has stood for generations, for a price that would not buy a parking space in your home city. That is the reward for knowing where to look.